A river of ice, 6 months out of 12, the St. Lawrence has long resisted man's efforts to conquer it. Because of its geography, the St. Lawrence may well be called the main character in Canadian history. While modern icebreakers can keep the river open for most of the year, the early sailors knew the St. Lawrence only as a mysterious waterway that promised much but demanded a high price. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed from France in search of a westward passage to China and its fabled riches. He found neither the Northwest Passage nor the Pacific. What he did discover was the St. Lawrence River. The following year, he made his way with a small fleet of 3 vessels as far as the Indian camp of Stadacone, today called Quebec. Cartier's journal provides a picture of how hard was the life of these first explorers. In the month of December 1535, we were warned that illness had befallen the people of Stadacone, so severe that more than 50 had already died. Then the illness began among us, a strange and unknown illness. Some of the men lost weight, and their legs became large and swollen. Their sinews shrank and became as black as coal, and some were spattered with drops of blood, nearly purple. Then the illness spread to the hips, thighs, and shoulders, to the arms and the neck, and they all had mouths so infected that the gums rotted, and all the flesh fell off down to the roots of the teeth, nearly all of which fell out. And this illness befell so many from our 3 ships that of our company of 110, not even 10 men remained healthy. Jacques Cartier is called the discoverer of the St. Lawrence, but he was not the first man to see it. For one thing, there were natives who lived here, but even as white European sailors go, there were others who preceded Cartier into the huge gulf that opens from Labrador to the shores of Nova Scotia. Around the year 1000, the Vikings came from Iceland. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, headed an expedition that explored Newfoundland and perhaps even the north shore of the St. Lawrence. 5 centuries later, Basque fishermen came in the summertime to hunt for whales and fish for cod in the waters of the estuary. But no European had any reason even to dream of the immense network of waterways beyond the basin of what was originally called the Great River of Canada. To understand the St. Lawrence, we must forget the traditional concepts about rivers. Its source is a freshwater lake, or combination of lakes, so large it dwarfs most seas, the Great Lakes. The St. Lawrence then proceeds for a rather modest 750 miles, half of which consists of its saltwater estuary. Then it empties into a vast gulf. The St. Lawrence was the first gateway toward the west in North America. Together with its large tributaries, it opened the door to the entire continent. The walking paths are what the first inhabitants called them, peoples who had inhabited the Americas for tens of thousands of years, but whom Columbus called Indians, less in error than self-justification. These natives were subject to all of the dangers and ills of primitive life. Their lives were not idyllic, but they were in harmony with their surroundings. And God created the earth as if he had unfolded a great blanket, and he put the Indians on it. They were created here. This is the truth. And this happened at the time when this river began to flow. Then God created the fish in the river and put deer in the mountains and made the laws according to which the fish and the deer multiply. Then God created us, the Indians, and gave us life. And when we saw the fish and the game, we knew they were made for us. And God made roots and berries for the women to gather, and the Indians grew and multiplied and became a people. When we were created, a land was given us to live on, and since that time, these were our rights. All this is true. We had the fish before the missionaries came, before the white man came. We were put here by the Creator, and these have been our rights as long ago as anyone remembers. "70 years after Cartier's discovery, New France was born. Henry IV made the grant to a governor-general, but entrusted the development of the colony to private companies, to which he delegated royal powers. In return for the profits to be derived from the territory, the companies undertook to see to its settlement and colonization. Samuel Champlain, the first governor, decided to establish his domain beside the Saint Lawrence near Quebec. Champlain dreamed of founding a great empire. The companies were looking for quick profits. As for the king, he showed little interest in this wilderness, which offered no promises of either gold or spices.
À la claire fontaine, m'en allant promener, j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baigné.
It was another story for the colonists, who had been promised 10 acres of land when they left France, but had a hard time getting even 5 along the banks of the great river. Witness the example of a Parisian apothecary, the first to try to set up a family business in 1617. Louis Hébert came with his wife, their 3 children, and his brother-in-law. They had nothing but their willingness to work.
Il y a longtemps que je t'aime, jamais je ne t'oublierai.
In exchange for 5 acres, each colonist owed the company the harvests of the first 2 years and undertook not to engage in fur trade.
J'ai perdu ma maîtresse sans l'avoir méritée. Pour un bouquet de roses que je lui refusai. Il y a longtemps que je t'aime, jamais je ne t'oublierai.
These were tough terms, and so it is not surprising that 50 years later, when Louis XIV attained the throne, there were only 800 families established in New France. At the same time, New England already had more than 50,000.
Il y a longtemps que je t'aime, jamais je ne t'oublierai.
For France, the task of colonizing the new lands was inextricably linked with the hopes and problems of converting the native populations. First, some Récollet friars, then the Jesuits accompanied the colonists. Looking for souls to convert, these were the first white men to settle on the banks of the Great Lakes, in the land of the Hurons, one of the 3 great Indian families, together with the Algonquins and the Iroquois, who lived around the Saint Lawrence Basin. From Quebec, where they set out, downstream to Montreal, It was a 30-day hardship-filled trip by canoe. In 1639, a mission was established at Sainte Marie, near Lake Huron. The Jesuits allied themselves with the Hurons, whom they were trying to convert, as protection from the increasingly vicious attacks of the Iroquois, the future allies of the English. The Iroquois were already using guns they had traded the Dutch in exchange for furs. The mission was built as a stockade, a fort. The first lock on the American continent was one built to enable the priests to bring food and supplies into the center of the living area. The narrow canal penetrated the fortification by means of a hidden entrance. Champlain's dream of a colonial empire called New France soon came to pass, on paper anyway. But the colony itself was not nearly as large as the map suggested. The St. Lawrence Basin had been explored in all directions, but there were no settlements other than fortified posts around which French and Hurons on the one hand, and English and Iroquois on the other, settled their dubious accounts in bloody skirmishes. The real action was played out along the network of riverways, the only way of accessing the most valuable resource of the region, furs. The protagonists in this drama were the trappers.
C'était un vieux sauvage, tout noir, tout barbouillant, Wichka, avec sa vieille couverte et son sac à tabac, Wichka. Ah, Atena, Wichka, Wichka, avec sa vieille couverte et son sac à tabac, Wichka. Ton camarade est mort et enterra, Wichka. Ah, Atela, Wichka.
Part traders, part explorers, they sought adventure in the true sense of the term. They carried in their pockets a license from the company. And they lived as the Indians taught them. Their incredible forays extended the French influence from Hudson's Bay as far as the Gulf of Mexico. If this life on the edge of the unknown was occasionally lucrative, its main attraction was the excitement. Many colonists abandoned the grinding work of cultivating the land to take to the rivers and the free life of the trade for furs.
Ces quatre vieux sauvages, qui portent les coins du drap. Wichita. Ah, Atena, Witenaga, Tena, Witenaga, Wichita. Ces quatre vieux sauvages qui portent les coins du drap. Wichita. Et deux gays sauvagesses qui chantent le libéra. Wichita. Ah, Atena, Witenaga, Tena, Witenaga, Wichita.
For 2 centuries, the fur trade accounted for most of the traffic along the St. Lawrence and its tributaries between Quebec and the Great Lakes. It represented 75% of the exports from New France, and those who invested in the companies recouped their money 10 times over.
Oh, oh, Atene.
The profit motive was strong enough to lure men into the wilderness, but so was their fascination with these strange people who believed in the Great Spirit and recognized its presence in the sun and the waters, in the moon and the forest. From the outset, the French administration legislated the nature of the dealings between fur traders and Indians, but since the government wouldn't risk sending anyone into the wilds to check on what was actually going on, trading was done simply between 2 men along the banks of the river. 1 gun was worth 6 beaver pelts, and a beaver pelt might be worth 2 pounds of gunpowder or 4 pounds of buckshot. The law forbade trading brandy, and the Jesuits inveighed against seducing the Indian maidens.
Ho, ho, Atane, ho, ho, Atane, ho, ho, Atane, Kayokina, Kayokina.
The population of New France settled along the St. Lawrence. The land grants, made from 1640 on, were along the banks of the St. Lawrence from Quebec to Montreal. The colony was self-sufficient and life was pleasant. But nothing, certainly not the King of France, inspired large numbers of French people to move to New France. The result was that New France was very large in territory, but was vastly, vastly outnumbered by the 13 American colonies. Some of the French colonists wanted to reach out, take Hudson's Bay. They established a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi. But France was more interested in what was happening in Europe. Threatened by events there, she ignored America, let Hudson's Bay, Newfoundland, and Acadia slip through her hands, let Louisiana be cut off. The Treaty of Utrecht was the beginning of the end of New France. But at the court of Versailles, they didn't know it. They didn't want to know it. The proof is in what happened at Louisbourg.
Prenez garde à vous! Portez le fusil sur le pont! En avant, marche! Corps de formation à droite! Go! 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 Droite! Go! 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 Droite! Go! Go!
Louisbourg was the perfect fort, situated at the gateway to the Atlantic on an island of Nova Scotia. A self-sufficient, well-equipped city, supposedly impregnable. It had cost enough to be impregnable, a king's ransom. From 1718 on, the entire defense of the St. Lawrence, the Gulf and the estuary, was based on Louisbourg. Its occupants were convinced that they could prevent any enemy from entering the St. Lawrence. Governor Beauharnois said so in his reports, but he knew that New France, curbed drastically by the Treaty of Utrecht, could barely put 1,100 men into the field against the 60,000 available to the English colonies. The governor knew it, and so did the English. Louisbourg, the model fortress, lasted a mere 40 years, while Europe was fighting the wars of the Austrian succession and England and France went to war. In 1759, Louisbourg, lacking the manpower to protect its rear, fell to an army of 14,000 under General Wolfe. The fall of Louisbourg was the preamble to a short campaign that climaxed at the Battle of Quebec. The final battle took place at the gates of the city on the Plains of Abraham. Irony of ironies, both commanders died in the battle, Wolfe and Montcalm. In 20 minutes, the fate of New France had been decided. The entire territory changed hands, and the St. Lawrence changed nationalities. 1760, the entire valley was now in the hands of the English. In accordance with the Treaty of Paris of 1763, the inhabitants had a choice between becoming British subjects or leaving the country within 18 months. New France was now added to the 13 English colonies, but not for long. During the American Revolution, Canada became a haven for Americans loyal to the King. After the war, there was a new territorial division. The St. Lawrence then became the boundary between the United States and Canada. There are actually two Canadas. In Lower Canada, the French-Canadian majority has remained a people apart. Nationalism and economic problems fuel discontent in the Richelieu Valley that joins Lake Champlain to the St. Lawrence. Occasionally, the discontent has boiled over. This is no melting pot. Alongside the St. Lawrence, Francophones and English speakers coexist. People with different roots, cultures, religions, with largely different ways of earning their livelihoods. It is a problem that will not go away. The British government realized that the country's economy traveled by river. Merchants needed control over the entire valley. Because of the lagging economy of Lower Canada, where the Catholic clergy encouraged the French-Canadian population to stick to farming, industrialization began in English-speaking Upper Canada. In the beginning of the 19th century, all of the territory along the upper part of the St. Lawrence and the north shore of Lake Ontario was rapidly gaining population. Hamlets gave way to villages and swelled into towns and cities as waves of immigrants arrived.
That's all I want. Well, that's all I need right now. Okay.
Governmental policies were instituted which hastened the shift from individual craftsmanship to industrialization.
Jack, Gary.
Times were changing. People no longer had the time or inclination to fight against the rapids in canoes. The first canal was dug, and locks multiplied to permit regular navigation and the safe and regular transport of goods and merchandise, conditions indispensable in a society of merchants and industrialists. Finally, the mighty powers of the river were harnessed for the first time. Modestly at first. But from the day a watermill first moved a mechanical saw, it was plain that a page had been turned in history. The lumber industry succeeded the fur trade. The Canadian forests seemed inexhaustible. The water power of the Saint Lawrence, the Saguenay, the waterway seemed unfathomable. The industrial age had come to Canada. In this progression toward industrialization, the prime mover was the Saint Lawrence River, because of its location, of course, but even more because of its unusual configuration. Its upper reaches and the Great Lakes themselves constitute a major part of the international boundary between Canada and the United States. Across the water, the two countries face each other with almost the same language, customs, currency. Almost. Windsor and Toronto are similar to Detroit and Cleveland, and yet no one would take one for the other. In their economic base and potential, their urbanization, the lifestyle of their citizens. In many ways, the future of the St. Lawrence is linked to the future of the American Midwest. The St. Lawrence is no longer a division, but a link between two interdependent economies, at the heart of the most populous region and the most heavily industrialized area of the American continent. For Canada alone, 60% of its population and 80% of its industry are concentrated along the shores of the Great Lakes and on the upper bank of the river. The Great Lakes represent an immense reservoir of water, fully a tenth of all the fresh water of the entire globe. From the far end of the Great Lakes to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, some 2,500 miles of waterway are open 10 months of the year to ocean-going ships of all kinds and nationalities. The great river of Canada has changed its name to the St. Lawrence, but it remains the Seaway. In the course of this Seaway, 17 locks carry the huge modern transport vessels from the Atlantic to a height of 600 feet, compensating for the picturesque but unnavigable drop of Niagara Falls. Like a staircase of water, with 8 locks which gradually regulate the difference of over 300 feet in water level, the Welland Canal enables boats to pass between Lakes Ontario and Erie. The canal is the centerpiece of the Seaway that was officially inaugurated in 1959. Since then, the St. Lawrence has been a major asset for business on both sides of the international border. The locks and canals are able to handle ships measuring up to 730 feet long and 75 feet wide.
Seaway, Welland, the Basin Fall on the wall above you, LA2 at the tin shed.
LA2 at the tin shed.
Roger, there'll be 3 down before we take you up, Martha Hyman.
7,000 to 8,000 ocean-going ships pass through here every year, carrying millions upon millions of tons of iron ore, grain, and industrial goods. Automation has taken over. Where once passage along the St. Lawrence was history and adventure, today it is business. Run jointly by the U.S. and Canada, the St. Lawrence is an international river all the way to the border of Quebec.
Le pilote est débarqué. OK pour monter. Le prochain descendant à 613 pieds. On va l'envoyer aux 50 pieds.
Which makes the people of Quebec the doorkeepers of America. But that is the U.S. side of the St. Lawrence. As for Canada, the river is central to Canada's existence, as the very location of Montreal proves. Situated between 2 arms of the St. Lawrence, Montreal is the largest river port in the world and the largest French-speaking city after Paris. each port has been important. Trois-Rivières, located halfway between Montreal and Quebec, is the largest producer of newsprint in the world. Only along the shores of Quebec does the Saint Lawrence for a brief moment take on the proportions and appearance of an old world river. The Indian name, Quebec, which means narrow river here, is closer to the French than the English pronunciation Quebec, obviously derived from its spelling. The Saint Lawrence will be transformed yet again, for from here on, its waters are seawater, salt water, and Quebec's tides are those of the salty brine. Downstream, they do not speak of the river or the shore, they say the coast or the gulf. And Sept-Îles, 7 Isles, where they say they walk on iron, is like a port on the sea. The economic importance of the St. Lawrence is hard to overestimate. Canada is a huge country rich in resources. It is among the world's largest sources of lumber, platinum, and nickel, and a major source of gold, uranium, and aluminum. With all this industrial modernity, it comes as a bit of a shock to find some fishermen whose methods have remained unchanged for centuries. Despite its immensity and its industrial preoccupation, the St. Lawrence has remained a place where human beings can relate to the water. While so many rivers have been killed with pollution, the very fact that the issue has been raised augurs well for the future. Today, as always, there is a need for pilots on the St. Lawrence to guide through the vast estuary and all the way to Montreal, those ships that move between the ocean and the heart of America.
Morning, Captain.
Good morning.
Had a good trip? Yes?
Good, best.
Wind is not so good, eh?
No,
All right. I'll meet you.
not too bad.
Where's your destination?
Conneaut, Ohio.
Ohio, huh? Very well. You have a good tide?
Good tide and the flood change. We're on the flood there now.
Uh-huh. Chanel Escoumé, Franklin Fall. Chanel Escoumé, ici Franklin Fall. Embarqué à bord, nous sommes au Fond-Prince, 1135.
Franklin Fall, canal Escoumé, bien sûr. On a 2 descendants pour les armes seulement.
Merci, bien reçu.
A source of life for the Indians, a route for colonization for the French who settled along its shores, then for the English who came to people the heart of the American continent. Today, one of the great waterways of the world, the St. Lawrence is the river that wrote the history of Quebec and Canada, that shaped the character and temperament of an entire nation.